Good evening, everybody.
Kavod Saraf, how are you?
Baruch Hashem, thank you. Okay. So here we go. Facebook. So we're continuing with Yosef. It says here, right, that from the quote in the Torah, that according to Rashi, right, in the Tshuva, "En lashin ela b'mayim shelanu shechashu chachamim l'rov ha'erot." So Rashi says, right, that we can only knead the dough with water that sat overnight. So regarding that, it says Bet Yosef, "Ze lashon harosh," this is the language of the Rosh. Besof perek kol sha'ah. In the end of this perek, in Gemara, minhag kasher shel harishonim. So he says it's an old custom. Shayu memal'in min haneharot b'tchilat leil. They would fill up the water from the rivers, the beginning of Leil Yudalad on the on the 14th. Shamayanot ubarot rotchin. So he says at that time the springs and the wells are too hot, so therefore, right, they prefer to take it from the river. Abalon naharot the Tanya v'pek mi she'aya tameh. So he says, but the rivers are not hot. As it says in the perek, Tzadik Dal Amud Bet, Be'arba shvilin hachama me'alechet. Right, so he says the sun takes 4 trajectories. Right, so what does that mean? You have the trajectory of Nisan, which is the spring, right? Iyar Sivan, these 3 months, right, which is Nisan and Iyar and Sivan, which is the springtime. Hachama melechet beharim. So he says the sun goes over the mountains. In other words, it's high up, relatively speaking. So Alma shebenisan ena me'alechet b'mayim. So you see from there, he says that during the Nisan, right, which is the month that we just mentioned, which is the month of Passover, it doesn't go over the waters. It doesn't go that down low. So he says, right, v'katav Rashi b'tshuva. Says Rashi, en lashin ela b'mayim shelanu. We should only use water which sat for, as we said, overnight. So what's the reason? Shechashu chachamim l'rov ayarot. Because the rabbis were concerned about most cities. She'en ela medbarot uberot. They only have well water or spring water. They don't have rivers. Hen otachin. And also, right, as we said, these sources, during this time of year, they're hot, the water. Mashma midbav. So it says, it implies from his words, the beniharot lekalamei chashmidi. When it comes to rivers, there's no concern, as we said, right? Because they're not hot. But it says that you shouldn't try to circumvent this problem, prohibition. So probably what he means to say is that even if you're taking from the river, as we said yesterday, you should still let it sit overnight. So it goes on. Katav, this rabbi says, so this rabbi says that the only problem really is that when it comes to, as we said, right, water which comes from springs and wells, that and he says this is the close to the time where the water, right, gets discharged, right, from its source. But he says when it comes to the rivers, right, which also flow in the daytime, or yomim or two. Right, I'm sorry, I didn't say it right. They're flowing 1 day or two, right? For the duration of 1 or 2 days. And lakpit kochach says we're not really so worried about it. כי כבר נתקרב הזמן, so he says because now it's already cool, and the end זה כלום, and so except for it's nothing, he says but he says the truth is, that you have to be careful with the rivers as well. Why is that? So he says the reason is because the sun, gets on them, so it does heat up the rivers, the sun. Okay, so in other words, the conclusion seems to be that even if you're using, as we said, right, water from the river, you still should let it sit overnight. That's the idea. So, okay, let's see the Shulchan Aruch here. Yeah, so we're going to review this. We started already yesterday, so we'll review. So it says, we'll go over the whole thing, I guess, whatever. בורות ומעיינות בין שהם בין נהרות ושואבים אותם מבעוד יום. So he says, when it comes to wells and springs, right? I'm sorry, I didn't. Yeah, there's one more line on top here. So first of all, Shulchan Aruch says, right, we only need with water which was right sat overnight. Ben shehem mebarot umayinot, whether it's right whether it's spring water or well water, ben shehem menarot, or whether it comes from the river, it's one standard for everything. The shavin otam miba'od yom. So he says we draw it, as we said right yesterday, before sunset. So it's still daytime, right? But right before sunset, more or less. Or you can do it also in twilight time, right? So what is twilight? Twilight means after sunset until the stars come out, right? That time is called twilight or whatever. In the Torah, that's the way it is, right? So it's like there's an interval of about 13 and a half minutes, right? Between sunset and the stars coming out. So that 13 and a half minutes is called, right, twilight, whatever. So anyway, right, you can do it there at that time as well. So either you do it before sunset or you do it after sunset, right, during twilight. Good. So then he says, right, so he says, and we don't start the kneading process until the whole night has passed, right? So meaning what? That we wait for dawn. We let it sit all night. Okay. So he says, also, he says, you can take water, to draw out even for several days, right? In other words, for the sake, enough to last you several days. That's what he means to say. You can take a large amount and save it, in the house, whatever. So he says, if that period, right, the weather now at that point is warm, right? It's a warm weather. So what should you do? I placed them in the cellar, right? Because right, which is cold at that time. So if the weather is hot, the cellar is cold. That's what he's saying. Okay. And it says if the weather is cold, right? Then what you do is put it outside. Nice and cool out there. Ki amartev hu cham, right? Why is that? So he says because at that point where it's cold outside, the cellar is not good, right? It's warmer the cellar, so therefore you don't want to use the cellar. Okay. וצריך להשכים ולהכניסם לבית קודם שיזרח השמש. So another thing he says, right, that you have to get up early and make sure you bring it into the house right before sunrise, because we don't want the sun getting on it, right, and start heating it up. So therefore, what you do is remove the water from from being outside, bring it inside, bring it indoors before sunrise, but after dawn, right? As we said, because it had to sit all night. So after dawn and before sunrise, that's when you got to bring it in. So how much time, by the way, is there before dawn and sunrise? 72 minutes, right? On the average. So that's what we're talking about. That interval of time is when you should bring in the water in from outdoors. Okay. So says the Rama here, right? Ve'im lo ichnisam b'hashkama. So he says if he didn't do that, right? In other words, his alarm clock didn't wake him up, right? So he he's overslept a little bit, right? So and the sun already came up, and he gets up, Oh, gee whiz, it's 7:30, right? The sun is already up. So what do you do then, right? What's the remedy? What do you do? Im lo amdu kol kach ad shichamu. So it says if they didn't stand such a long time that they're going to get heated up, and no mazik, right? It doesn't hurt you. There's no problem. You can still use that water. So meaning what? That as long as the water is still cool, right? You can still use it, even though it stood in the sun for a little while. No big deal. But he says the better way to do it, as we said right yesterday, is to place the water, under some kind of a ceiling, right? Whatever, some kind of a roof, some kind of a canopy, whatever it is, right? To protect it from the sun. So this way, right? If the sun does come up, so it'll be shielded by the cover, by the canopy, whatever it is. Okay, good. ויותר היה, שמא ישכח יכנסם בהשכמה. וכשמוליך המים, so he says, when he's carrying the water, תחת האוויר הרקיע, right, in the outside, outdoors, יש לכסות אותם, so you should cover it, he says, right? Yeah, I mean, you can understand why you should do that. You should cover the water, because otherwise you can get all kinds of, insects in there or stuff. God knows what. I guess that's the reason why. Interesting. Let me just see what the Mishnah Berurah says here about this. Why should you cover the water? You may have some nice insight here.
I heard it was because the spiders and scorpions will crawl down there and drink from it and put venom on it.
What will they put in there? In the venom in there?
Yeah, because if a spider will come to a water source and drink, his teeth or whatever are touching it.
Interesting. Yeah, I got it. So, yeah, I understand that. So, what does the Mishnah Berurah here say? Anyway. Okay, so the Mishnah Berurah understands it differently, right? He says the problem is that the reason why you should cover it is because of the sun, you don't want it to heat up from the sun. Okay, whatever, we get the idea. So that's the story, right? So you should cover it. So what is he talking about, right? You should cover it when you're moving it because it's already, the sun has already come up. You went out there a little bit late, right? Whatever, so you should cover it. Okay. So the truth is, that there's two different things going on here, just to clarify this a little bit. What you're talking about, that the issue with, all kinds of, insects getting in there and, like we mentioned, things like this, that applies, the truth is, like all night. I mean, when you take it outside, you should cover it in order that, insects shouldn't get in there. But here, he wasn't talking about that. He was talking about that you should cover it when you're moving it indoors, something, unique more. So what's the reason for that? So the reason for that is because, as we said, right, that the sun, So two different things, going on. Obviously, if it's sitting outdoors, you should cover it. I mean, otherwise, as you said, right, there's going to get in there all kinds of things. That's pretty clear. Okay, so anyway, right, that's a story. So yeah, so getting back to the Ramah. Mhm. Right, so it says here, "K'shechal Pesach be'echad b'Shabbat." Let's say Passover falls on Sunday, right? So what does that mean? Saturday night. That's what we're talking about, right? You're doing the seder on Saturday night, Motzi Shabbat. So in a case like that, right, the question is, when should you draw the water to make the matzot? In those days, everybody made it at home, right? That's the way it was, They didn't go to the store and buy ready-made matzot, right? No such a thing like that in those days. So everybody baked it at home. So the advice is over here that when should you draw the water if the seder falls on Saturday night? So he said you should do it right on Wednesday night, right? Which is already like Thursday. It's right. It's already beginning of Thursday. Wednesday night. So that's tonight. Wednesday night's tonight. So what does that mean? That if you do it Wednesday night, it's gonna sit right for when you're gonna make the matzot, by the way. You're gonna make it on Friday, right? Because she can't do it on Shabbat, right? And the seder is on Saturday night, so you're not gonna have time to bake it, right? Saturday night, right? There's no time for that. So therefore, right? You should bake it on Friday, right, or whatever, something like that. Either right Thursday night or Friday morning, and that's why you should draw the water one day before, right? Which is Wednesday night. That's what he's telling you. Okay. Yeah. So then he goes on, לכתחילה יש לשאוב מן הנהרות ולא מן הבארות. Right? It says לכתחילה, right? The best way, the preferred way, as we said, right, in the Beit Yosef, better to draw the water from river and not to draw the water from the springs, because the springs are hot, right? So that's the preferred method, right? Today we take it from the tap, So what does that mean, right? Take it from the cold water side, right? Not from the hot water. Don't open the hot water. Open the cold water, and that's your river, right? Pretty much, right? For us modern guys, right? Okay, so yeah, that's obvious, right? You're not going to take from the hot water. אבל כשנהרות גדולות, so it says, מהפשרת השלגים וגשמים, טוב יותר לשאוב מן הבארות. But it says, if the river is inundated, because of melting of the snow, so the height of the river goes up, right? Or because of the rain, then he says, then it's better to take it from the well. Interesting, right? Why is that? Why don't we want to take it from the river when it's the level is high? So let's look at the Mishnah Berurah. Maybe he explains this, right? All right. Not really sure why that is. So it says Mishnah Berurah. Look what he says. Interesting, right? So he says at that time of year, when the river is high like that, so he says the well water, it gets cold. More so than the river. So why is that? So he says because in the time of Nisan, right, the month of Nisan, which is April, right, for us, right, as we said, right, that the sun goes higher, into the mountains, to melt the snow. So therefore, look what he says, right? So therefore, what happens is like this: when the sun goes on the mountains and melts the snow, what happens is that that water is sort of like warm because the sun was on it for a while, So therefore, that in that scenario, better to take from the well, right? Why is that? Because the well is colder at that time. Interesting. So this is what the Ramah says, right? According to the explanation of Mishnah Berurah, Okay, very nice. So let's go on. Yeah. So he says, ואין לשפוך מים שלנו מכוח מת או תקופה נופלת. Look what he says. Wow. So he says, right, that I have to, give you guys a little bit of an introduction into this before I explain to you, before you get it, but he says like this, right, that, let's say, for instance, by the way, there's two scenarios in Judaism where you have to like spill out your water, that you have in your house. You can't drink it, right? You know which two scenarios we're talking about? One is when somebody dies, right? Lo aleinu, in the area that you live in, right? So if somebody dies in that area, we're talking about the immediate area, right? Not far off. So there's a whole discussion about that, how that applies, how that works, whatever. But if somebody dies, right, in that immediate area that you live in, the custom is, to spill out the water from the house that you have in your home. What's the reason for that? So, the sages say, right, that what happens is that water could possibly be contaminated. What's the reason why? Because they say, right, that the Satan, when he comes to take the neshama of somebody, right, somebody's soul, right, to kill him, basically, right, what he does is he says he takes his sword and soaks it in water, to clean it off from the blood. This is all spiritual, of course. It's not physical, right? There's no blood in there, but it's a spiritual thing. So that's the reason why you can't drink the water, because it could be contaminated, from the sword of the Satan. That's what it says, right? So this is the reason why we dump out all the water when somebody dies, in the area, in the immediate area, right? It's all discussion about that, what that means, right? I'm not going to get into it now. It's not scope right now. There's also another time that we dump the water. We just had it, by the way, recently, a couple of weeks ago, which is that when you have like a what do they call it, a solstice or something, whatever it's called, something, right? When you have when you're switching from one season to another, right? That day, where the solstice, whatever it's called, occurs. That day, right? The water is dangerous to drink. So therefore, also we spill it out. So says the Rama, by the way, it's only for an hour, the whole thing. But anyway, right, says the Rama that when it comes to water that you're using for Passover, he says, for making the matzot, you don't have to spill it out, for these reasons, he says. Interesting. Right. I guess the reason is because you're not drinking it, you're using it for kneading. I don't know. Anyway, you know what? That's not the reason, because you're going to eat it anyway, right? That's not the issue. The issue is that the reason why he says not to dump it is because since that water is designated for a certain purpose, right, which is for kneading the matzah, so therefore the Satan will not touch that water. He only touches water which is just your average garden variety water, in your house, right, in your Brita filter, right, whatever is that, something like that, right? But when you're talking about special water which is for a certain purpose, right, so there the Satan will play with that. I'm sorry, he won't play with it, right? He won't touch that. Just the opposite, right? He won't touch it. He doesn't go into that specialty stuff. He only goes into regular water. So yeah, so that's the reason why you don't have to spill it out. But says Rama anyway, Gam asur lishov mayim and we do the mitzvot shel matzah. So he says you shouldn't draw the water, for this purpose, by way of a goy. Don't use a goy for this. He says, interesting. The afla shar mitzvah. So this is also for other mitzvot as well. Yishav Israel should be a Jew that draws the water. Interesting. Imef shar, but it says only possible, right? In other words, it's not really critical, this thing, right? We just prefer that a Jew should do it. The question is why, right? So let's see the Mishnah Berurah, right? He's helped us already quite a lot here. So let's see if he'll come through for us again, right? Let's see what he says about why shouldn't you draw by way of a goy? So let's see what he says. So, so the Mishnah Berurah says, right? Since it's like preparation for a mitzvah, this is the reason why. So what does that mean? Right? What is that? So you know what he's trying to say, basically, that we prefer, right, that the Jew should do the mitzvah. Why? Because he gets, rewarded for that, right? So why should you give your mitzvah to a goy, when you're going to be rewarded for doing the mitzvah? So it says, right, the Mishnah Berurah, this is only lechatchila. In other words, this is a preferred way to do it. But if for some reason, right, you can't do it, let's say, you don't feel good, right, whatever, right? You don't feel strong enough, whatever, or whatever it is, right? You're feeling dizzy, whatever, right? You got dizzy. So what do? You let the goy do it. Okay, fine. But if possible, better to let the Jew do it since it's a mitzvah matter, and he gets rewarded for that. So why should you give it to a goy? And that's the whole thing, right? That's what it says in the Mishnah Berurah. Okay. So he's come through for us already a lot, Mishnah Berurah here, right? He's explained everything. Baruch Hashem. He was a big rabbi, big chacham. Okay, so right, that's the story there. Let's go on in the Ramah. So right, so you see, right, there's a lot of details here in the Ramah, and that's why I didn't want to do it yesterday, because I wanted to do it, nice and relaxed, like without being pressured by the stopwatch. To make sure we get everything straight. There's a lot of details here. So he says here, the Ramah in the end, ונוהגים ליטול מים מיוחדים למצה של מצווה. Oh, so he says, right, that the custom is to use special water for this purpose. So, what does it mean special, right? What's special about water, right? Because water is water, right? What's special about it? What he means to say is, right, that it should be designated for that, But let's see what the Mishnah Berurah says. I'm not really 100% sure. Let's see how he explains this. So says the Mishnah Berurah, right, so the Mishnah Berurah alludes to the reason. Doesn't say it explicitly, but right, the point is like this, right? That you gotta designate the water, for that purpose. That's what it means to say, right? So meaning what? Don't just like draw water, like for your household, you know what I mean? And that's for all purpose use, and then just take from there. You should say, no, I'm drawing. You should think like this or say like this. That's what Mishnah Berurah says. You should say it. Now I'm drawing this water for the mitzvah. In order to emphasize, right, that you're doing it for the mitzvah. So yeah. So the truth is, right, this is not something very, very critical. But it's like a nice touch, like sort of a stringency a little bit, but right, anyway, nice touch. Obviously, this is not really critical at all. Same, by the way, concept goes for Shabbat. They say, right, that when you go shopping for Shabbat, and you're buying food for Shabbat, so you should, you should say, right, that this food is for Shabbat. So this way, it's like you designating it for the mitzvah, to eat on Shabbat. So they're also right. It's not really an obligation to do that. The same thing, it's like a nice touch, like icing on the cake, a little bit, right? Because Hashem knows you're buying it for Shabbat. You know what I mean? You don't have to tell him you're buying it for Shabbat. He knows. But anyway, it's good to say so, because right this way, you're making it more. You're solidifying the concept more. So same thing over here as well, right? Same idea. Okay, good. So let's go back to the Ramah here. Let's finish it off. Yeah. So he says, right, that ונוהגים לקח כלי חרס חדשים. ואין לשנות המנהג, אבל בשל עץ אין להקפיד. So he says, also he says that the custom is to use a new utensil for this purpose. So what does that mean, right? You use a new earthenware, right, clay utensil. He says the custom is like that. So what's the reason why? Because the old ones may have some taste, from chametz, in there. So he says, right. So in other words, what he's trying to say like this: if you want to use clay, you should get new ones. That's a custom, right? Custom is like that. But if you have wood ones, right, wood, you don't have to be careful about that. You don't need to buy a new one. So why clay and why not wood, right? What's the reason why? So the reason is because clay absorbs a lot of taste, and it lets it off little by little. But the wood, right, not so much. So therefore, right, the wood is not really a big problem. So that you don't have to get a new one, But when it comes to clay, it says, right, the customer is to get a new one. Okay, so the truth is, first of all, right, I have to tell you that a lot of the things that he writes over here, the Ramah, are like sort of like stringencies, not exactly halacha. That's number one. Number two, also, right, a lot of them are Ashkenazi customs, what the Sfarim don't do, all these things. So, you gotta take it with a grain of salt, right? Each case has its own merits, right? And its own parameters. So whatever, right? But this is just basically a rundown, right, of the whole thing. Right? Okay, that's the idea. So what else we got here? Okay, let's see what else we have left. I'm sure we have a lot of things left. Yeah, so we're going to bet here, right? So it says here in bet, umayim המכונסים בקרקע הבנוי תחתיו בסביבותיו שקוראים סיסטרנה, right? So it says, right, if you're going to take the water, you see this word cisterna that it says here, right? In English, the same thing, right? Cistern. If you take the water from a cistern, right, which is like, some kind of a, it's like built into the ground, some kind of a cement structure there, right? And the water is gathered in there. So if you're taking it from there, so he says, then it seems, look what he says, right? You don't really have to let it sit overnight if you're taking it from there. Why is that? Because it's like utensil, in other words, it's already sitting in utensil, right? Meaning what? Right? Those cement walls that it has, right? And the whole, it's like utensil. Okay. So he says, so therefore he says they don't really get hot from the sun. That goes under the ground. In other words, when it goes on the other side of the earth, right? The sun doesn't affect it. Why is that? Why isn't the sun affected? Because right, that structure that's built there, which is made from whatever it is, right, stone or cement, whatever it is, right, it guards it from the sun. So therefore, the sun doesn't hit it. Okay. וגם אין החמה מכה עליהם. So it says also the right, the water, the sun doesn't hit it really also. In other words, it doesn't directly, get to that point, to that area. לכן כתב באורחות חיים. This is also, right, says in אורחות חיים, same thing. בשם הרעב"ד, ניב לרעב"ד, מצאתי כי, so it says, וזה לשונו. So this language that he writes there. בשם הרעב"ד מצאתי, he says, I found the name of the רעב"ד, כי מהדות שהם קרים, אין צריכים לינה, ומותר ללוש בהם תכף שנשאבו, right? So he says, also, if you have, right, as we said, right, this kind of structure, the same thing he says, right? You don't need to, so, in other words, if it's sitting in a structure like that, the water, as we just mentioned, right, in the cistern, whatever it is, right, you don't need to really let it sit overnight. It's already cool as it is. So you see from there, by the way, that if the water is cool, right, there's nothing you need. You don't have to let it sit overnight. So, right, we have a fridge, Baruch Hashem, you put it in the fridge for 2 hours, it's cold, right? That's it, right? Finished. Nothing to talk about. Right? So that's all you need. So as long as the water is cool, that's it, right? You're all set. By the way, that may also mean, think about it for a second, right? That may also mean if you just pull the water out of the cold water tap, right? That may be good enough as is. Because, it's also like, some kind of a utensil underground, you know what I mean? Right? The pipes, they're pretty cool, those pipes. And certainly the sun doesn't hit them, right? They're all covered. So therefore, according to this, the truth is, that you may be just able to, take the cold water tap, take from there the water, and use it right away. You don't have to let it sit overnight. Interesting, right? So yeah. אבל הוגדי שמים אלו בחורף הם חמים. But it says, I was told that in the winter that water is warm, right, from the cisterns. כמו מי just like the wells. ואם כן, אין להקל בדבר. So it says, therefore you shouldn't be lenient, right, when it comes to those cisterns. אם לא בשעת הדחק, unless it's like, a pressing situation. In other words, you don't have anything else besides that. And you're in a hurry, so you got to do it right away, right? So in a case like that, and then you can be lenient. Okay, so we'll do the Shulchan Aruch and we'll stop there. But the truth is, we learn from here a very important principle here, which is that if the water is cold, right, as is, doesn't need nothing. That's clear. It doesn't have to sit overnight. Makes sense. Yeah, pretty logical, right? You don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand that. Okay, so let's see the Shulchan Aruch. So again, right? Yes, it says the Shulchan Aruch. Yes, omrim shemayim memuchonasim b'cisterna, right? So it says if you have water which is gathered in the cistern, right? Mutar lalush b'hem, you're allowed to knead with it samuch l'shebatan right away, right? When you pull it out, when you draw the water. Then lakil b'davar, but it says you shouldn't be lenient. It says im lo b'shat adchak, unless it's a pressing situation. Right? As we said, right? What's the reason why you shouldn't be lenient? Because sometimes the water in the cistern is not cold; it's hot. During right certain times, certain periods, right? So therefore, right, you shouldn't be lenient regarding that, unless it's a pressing situation. But when it comes to right, water that is cold, right? For instance, as we said, right, and like it was sat in the fridge, so then there's nothing to talk about, right? It's obvious, it's clear, right? There's no reason to be stringent about that. Also, the cold water tap in general, right? The water is pretty cold from there. As a general rule, the water is pretty darn cold. Like where I live in New York, when you open the cold water tap, it's really cold water. Right? Like, it's not warm. It's not lukewarm. It's not nothing like that. So it seems like it will be fine as is, But right, as we said, right, if you want to be more stringent, just put it in the fridge, for a couple of hours, and you're all good. You're all set to go. Okay, very good. So let me just see what the Mishnah Berurah here has to say about this. You may have something to add. Get a little bit extra wisdom over here. Yeah, so he brings all kinds of things, that existed in his time, like types of water that they were drawing from different, right, you know, different venues, right, whatever, right. So, but I don't really know, what this means today for us because we don't, really have these things maybe. But anyway, right, the bottom line is, you see from here one thing that, if you know the water is cold, it's okay, But right, as we said, you put it in the fridge. That should be really fine, Or if you know, right, your tap is really, really cold, right, like mine is, so then it really should be no problem. Okay, so I guess we'll stop there. B'ezras Hashem, we'll continue next time. Thanks for coming. Be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. Chazak Baruch and Laila Tov. God bless you.
Kavod Harav. Thank you so much. Amen.
All the best.
God bless, Rabbi.
All the best.